Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 21. Race to the Rock. Evrain was perplexed to learn of the prowler outside his house. Though their protectors had driven off the potential assassin, he trembled to think that he had come so close to failing in his duty to the king and to the boy he was supposed to safeguard. He at once determined to keep a sober mind and a closer watch on his charge. That day he steered sullenly, nursing the steady throbbing in his temples, while Lur practiced the crew in shifting their weight rapidly from leeward to windward or back, as the variable wind dictated. Each crew member had been assigned specific duties by now, though Lur still reminded them by name when they had to perform them, leaving Evrain free to study the small shifts in wind direction and velocity, so crucial to gaining and keeping the edge over competitors. They headed out towards one of the many shallows off the Keel coast, for the weather was favorable for fishing, and the men eager to haul in their first catch, while the watermen kept a lookout for signs of seabirds feeding. Lur explained to Gareth how he was to assist with the casting, dragging, and hauling in of the net. It seemed simple enough to the eager boy, despite the warning of a hard struggle if the net was full. When Evrain was satisfied with their location, he had them lower the sails and put out a sea anchor. Since there were no clear signs of a concentration of fish, Maelor and Yulan readied themselves to go over the side and take a look. Gareth, who had already flung aside his rein, prepared to accompany them. Lur reminded him, however, that he was no waterman, and insisted that he tie a safety rope round his ankle. He protested half-heartedly, but took the thin cord from Lur when the latter mentioned the abundance of sharks in the fishing waters. Gareth could well understand the love the watermen had for the blue-green depths of the sea. Once the first shock of cold had faded, and his sun-warm body had adjusted to the fresh, cool press of water, he became aware of the number of unique sensations this world beneath the surface offered. The light fell in long, bright streaks all around, robbed of vibrant color, soft and shy. No sound breached the complete stillness, at once rendering voice, words, and meaning superfluous. The world of these, however close, was shut off by the curtain of water, and for a moment or two he could touch the peace of isolation. After working his way down till the pressure closed uncomfortably on his skin, he could float free, weightless, back to the surface. He imagined that it had to be something like flying, as if one was lighter than the air, a body made only of thought and aspiration. The watermen had glided over to separate sides. No cord tied them to the boat. How he envied them. They moved with such ease and grace through the depths. His lungs were burning for air, and they could remain 3-4 times as long without effort. He spread out his arms and allowed the water to push him slowly from the silence. Far off to starboard, he caught the glimmer of light on the silver sides of fish. He was shouting almost before he had reached the surface and drawn fresh air into his lungs.
Lur, that way!
He rose out of the water to point hurriedly.
Hundreds of them!
Lur peered in the direction he was pointing.
Hundreds of what? Oil or silverbacks?
I don't know. Fish!
Yulan surfaced noiselessly next to him.
On! A big shoal! Moving slowly that way!
He jerked his head in the direction of the bow.
Ah, that's just fine.
Lur smiled as he turned to Evrain.
A good start to the season.
Gareth and the watermen clambered on board and hurried to ready the net. The sea anchor was hauled in, and the sails hoisted with the speed and efficiency of long experience. For the Nurian boy it was all a blur of excitement, but he kept his head, and Lur had no need to goad him with shouted instructions.
They are floating with the current.
Evrain stared into the sea as if he could glimpse the twisting and turning of the shoal.
We'll run across from the windward side, then work our way back.
The first run filled their net, and they hauled it in with eager speed. It was a struggle to heave it aboard, and Evrain had to lash the tiller and join his crew before they managed it. The men were smiling at one another. Out tumbled a multitude of squirming, jumping bodies, short, squat fish, tinted red on their fins and around the eye. Now the men worked with energy to channel the catch into the bins fore and aft, raking the fish with long-handled implements.
Another run like this, and we can turn for port.
Lur paused to straighten his back. As he did so, he caught a glimpse of an approaching sail in the wind-spawned haze. Instantly, he recognized the emblem on its mainsail, a single red band dissecting the triangular white of the cloth.
Imran's breath, of all people.
Evrain raised his eyes for a glimpse.
Ballred.
He dropped the rake and scurried back to the tiller.
Lur, drop the mainsail. I'm dead before I show that parasite which way we're running.
In a skilled maneuver, the Sunsway attacked to meet the other fishing boat, simultaneously slowing to a crawl. The men went back to their work, while Evrain alone stood in the bow, braced for the inevitable exchange. The boat approaching them was almost identical to the Sunsway. It was slightly broader in the beam, making it appear less sleek, though heavier and sturdier. A bearded, sun-browned man stood in the bow, his red-banded rein flapping about his slight body in the breeze. The mainsail of the newcomer also went down, as the vessel closed up to them. A shout of greeting caught on the wind reached their ears. Evrain raised one hand and returned the shout. He had to admit to himself that the other's crew had some skill, for the visitors slipped alongside the Sunsway with ease and grace. There stood the current champion of the hunting race to the rock, barely 20 paces away, in the bow of his champion boat, and so aware of his status. Evrain could taste the envy. It had been 12 long cycles since he had stood like that. Bullred of Keel, master of the Blue Reef, was notorious and disliked for several reasons. His annoying habit of latching onto successful fishermen and copying their every move was the primary among them. He was not without skill, however, and he had proved it in the race the previous cycle. This occurrence had elevated another of his bad qualities, his boastfulness, all the more. Now he stood like a conquering hero, his thin arms folded across his chest.
Captain Evrain, back in the running I see.
His voice maintained the condescension in his manner.
Back from the north, yes.
Evrain wanted to emphasize the fact that he was not merely the master of a boat who had taken a holiday.
In time for the race?
In time, yes.
There was a little pause, and it appeared as if Ballred would pull away and leave them in peace. But then he seemed to remember something, and his voice floated across once more.
A tragic thing? What happened to your son?
Evrain stiffened a little, but made no reply.
I was sad to hear of it. Zane would have made a fine sailor.
Yes, he would have.
Evrain could not quite read the other's intentions.
I know a good lad if you need one on your crew.
Evrain smiled to think that Ballred could think him such a fool.
I have one already.
The slight man raised his chin a little and moved his hands to his hips.
You cannot hope to replace Zane with a half-wit from Nuria.
All the men from the Sunsway looked up quickly, pausing in their work. Baylor and Yulan turned to Lur, who shook his head slowly in warning. The new member of their crew was not to be discussed. Evrain was tiring rapidly of the conversation, but did not want to show his annoyance.
So you say.
And you still have your watermen. I was hoping for a challenge this cycle, but you seem to have kissed winning goodbye.
He waved condescendingly before turning away.
Good catch.
At his instruction, the Blue Reef turned away sharply, her men grinning in farewell. Just before passing beyond hailing distance, Bulrid's raised voice reached them a final time.
Will you even enter the race?
He's worried,
Lur smirked to the others.
and he should be.
He placed his hands on his hips also.
And what does he mean with good catch? Can't he see we already have one? Makes you wonder who the halfwit is.
Evrain shouted back his answer while holding up a hand to shield his eyes from the sun.
I'll be there.
Maelor turned to Gareth with a smile.
How is the halfwit from Nuria today?
Without waiting for a reply, he threw a questioning glance at Lur.
I did not know it was to be kept a secret.
Oh, it's no secret. It's just the first impression people had of him. And it'll be the one to last. You know what the men of Kiel are like. Even if this boy should later discover a way for a man to soar through the heavens, all they would say is, there goes the clever halfwit from Nuria.
During the days that followed, the runs of the Sunsway settled into a familiar pattern. The crew would practice tacking on their way out, and again when sailing back to Kiel. Though this made the trip nearly twice as long, it was an essential part of their training, and no one complained that the cleaning and processing of the catch would keep them occupied till late afternoon. Barely 10 days remained before the racing boats would flock to the starting line outside the harbor. The catches were invariably good, and they brought back load after load of harn to be gutted, smoked, dried, or pickled and stored in vats. It was hard work, dragging them from their beds before first light, and keeping them occupied almost to the slipping away of Imran's orb. There was time for little else. Gareth rose earlier still, for he enjoyed the quiet before the day, when he could glide alone through the dark ocean, avoiding the morning tension at Evrain's house. The latter still lingered in the alehouses along the beach, soon slipping back into the habits he had determined to break. In the mornings, he moved about like a sleepwalker, and wore his red, bleary eyes till noon. An atmosphere of gloom settled over the crew, though the days were bright and the fishing excellent. Evrain's temper was short, but he never raised his voice. Instead, he would sink into a sulking silence, and everyone would know that there would be no practicing that day. Lur secretly doubted that they would even enter the race, unless there was a dramatic change. On the 10th day, Evrain left instructions for the crew to tend to the nets and sails, while he went out on his own in a small boat. Lur remarked that these needed no repairs as yet, but this comment was not well received. After their captain's departure, the men decided to take the Sunsway out by themselves, or the day would be wasted. They ran her up and down just outside the bay till noon, and then turned for home. There would be time enough to check the nets. They landed to meet a red-faced Evrain. It was clear that he had already been drinking, and had no capacity for being reasonable. Lur was the only one who made an attempt to avert a disastrous confrontation, but he achieved little more than drawing attention to himself and bearing the brunt of Evrain's ire. The watermen stood in grim silence, while Gareth stared down at the sand, acutely embarrassed by the behavior of a man he had come to respect and like. Lur lost his patience in the end, and stalked off while Evrain was still shouting. This seemed to bring the captain to his senses, for he fell to mumbling and looking awkward. Then, unable to face the watermen, he turned on his heel and walked away. Gareth tried to find an excuse for him,
He's angry.
Yulan spoke all their thoughts.
He needs to stop being angry now. He will make enemies of all his friends.
Fear gripped Gareth's heart.
You will not leave him now.
The Murden looked at each other, then back at the boy. Yulan slowly shook his head.
Not yet.
Gareth spent the afternoon wandering about the harbor. The place had a sturdy wall of broken rock and boulders, overlaid with stout planking. He noticed that most of the fishing boats were out. It was annoying to think that Bullred and others like him were sharpening the skills of their crews, or even just making a good catch, while they were bound to the quayside. He climbed down a wooden ladder to the water level, where the rough stones had been shaped into blocks, and heavy iron mooring rings hung from large staples driven into the rock. The ledge of stone was covered in slippery moss and weed, with the sharp edges of barnacles poking through here and there. He had to take care not to cut his bare feet or slip off the rock into the water. When he had found a place of relative comfort, he sat down and let his legs over the side to where his feet could touch the water below. The tide was receding, and soon it would be beyond his reach. The place had been shaped who knew how long before, and carried the markings of extensive use and exposure. The mooring rings and staples were reddish-brown with rust, some bleeding their substance onto the stained rock around them. Hordes of tiny crustaceans clung to the wet stone, satisfied with the rhythmic flow and ebb of countless tides. The wood of the steps, rotting round heavy nails, lay stark and bare under the gaze of the weathering sun, or the lashing gale-driven rain, till it no longer had the strength to resist decay. What stories lingered in this place? What adventures had commenced or been concluded here? Right away, he could imagine tall men who walked warily under cover of dark to bring their contraband into the town, or pirates daring the garrison of Kiel to action as they carried off the treasures from a temple. Yet, perchance this peaceful corner had seen only the slow struggle of determined men against the sea, wrenching their living from the elements themselves, and sometimes paying the terrible cost. At once, he could see the father and his dark-haired son, and almost feel their fear as the waves rose round their little craft. The sun had long been pressed from the sky by the purple smoke of heavy cloud, and the eager wind, sensing an easy prey, rushed down on them. The sail was torn and gone, the steering oar had slipped away, and then the rain, as if to drown all of Arran, lanced down from the dark sky, till they could hardly see each other in the grey dance. Then they had known they were lost, and powerless in the tumult, and had clung to each other in farewell. Gareth gripped the razor edges of the mollusk shells, till pain tore him away from the angry sea. He had no desire to see the blinded eyes in the son's cold face, or hear the agony of the father's cry. The sun was bright and warm, far from such dim dreams, and he knew that Evrain was not angry. He was still sinking with the body of his son, alone in the stark sea. He thought of Raed, and of the Queen, and how he had not been able to help them in the end. Even had they not died, they had both been beyond his reach, isolated in their worlds of pain. What good was it to know, if one had no power to change things? He did not want to know, and yet he did, for he could not witness the pain of others without it finding an echo inside him too. Why would it concern him if Euban sat alone in his cold house? But the old man had had a need for company and comfort so strong that the stones and shelves of his storeroom had screamed it out. Who could be deaf to such a cry? Yet he had been as unable to fill the emptiness in an old man's life as he now was to be a substitute son for a grieving father. Why had Kenneth ever put him in the path of this man? Would he not simply slip away like the others had? A sudden cloud obscured the sun and left him in shadow. Dread certainty took hold of him. He did not go to look for Evrain that evening. While making his way towards the taverns, he had realized that the man would most assuredly not want his nagging presence at this time. Instead, he made his way home, feeling like a deserter, but not knowing what else to do. The next day he would try to speak to Evrain, in spite of his morbid disposition. He found it almost as hard to ring the bell at the gate while alone as when he had to ring it with an inebriated Evrain slumped between him and Blur. What would Miriel think now that he was home without her husband? But the woman and her daughter were silent and tearful as always, and though he longed to speak to them, he searched for words in vain. He ate in silence, but made a point of thanking Miriel before he crept away to his room. The wind of the day had died down completely, and the night was pleasantly warm. He opened the shutters of his window, disrobed and stretched out on the bed. The brighter stars already stared at him from the wan sky. He closed his eyes to shut them out, and hoped for dreamless sleep. At first, he had no inkling of what had awakened him. He sat up. He had not pulled up the covers, and it might simply be the cool of the night that now urged him to do so. The next moment he was on his feet, glancing about for the gutting knife. Some heavy object had struck the wall close by, the inner wall that separated his room from the dining chamber. Then came a long, drawn-out shout of frustration, and he knew there was no intruder in the house. It was the climax of yet another violent argument. He held his breath. It seemed somehow different this night, and he felt the fear of it where he was standing. A woman screamed, Miriel no doubt, and the little girl started crying hysterically. He wanted to hide and stop up his ears, but he found himself on hands and knees searching for the colored shirt. Another crash echoed dully as he found it. He hastily pulled the rein over his head, then hurried to the next room. Several chairs had been overturned, and he wondered whether these had been the objects flung against the wall. The only light was on the table behind the staggering man, and spilled over the scene in a desperate wave. Miriel stood in front of her husband, her eyes staring in fearful defiance, her body quivering with tension. Behind her hid the little girl. Evrain was completely beside himself, and had raised a hand, Gareth thought, to strike her. He rushed round the table, the shout already in his throat.
No!
He could not tell after how he had reached the man before the blow could fall, or whether the unexpected shout had made the latter hesitate. But Evrain had no opportunity to commit the unthinkable. In front of him, with both arms raised, stood a stranger, an intruder in his nightmare. He tried to step around him. Gareth turned with him, till they had moved almost full circle, and the lamplight fell on Evrain's face. The man was unsteady on his feet, his eyes staring. Rage and pain still contorted his features, but it was apparent that he had little idea of what he was doing. Before he could lift his hand again, Gareth grabbed him round the chest, pinning his arms. Certainly, the drunken man could have shaken him off with ease, but instead he froze, eyes blinking, as if he could not comprehend what had just occurred. For a moment he stood thus, then slowly and wearily he sank to the floor, bearing down the boy on top of him. When Gareth realized the man was no longer moving, he rolled away and stood up. The woman and girl were crying softly, huddled together now. He looked at them, then at the prostrate man. His own hands were shaking.
Help me!
His voice broke through the shocked aftermath and stirred Miriel to action. Together they dragged the body away to bed. None too gently, the unconscious man was deposited in the spare room. Gareth closed and locked the door behind him. It was awkward facing Evrain's family after such a stormy scene. Gareth did not know what to say to them. He merely placed the key on the table and turned to go back to his room. He was about to disappear into it when he felt Miriel's hand on his arm. Her whisper was warm and sincere.
Thank you.
He hesitated and turned to look at her, but she retreated as quickly and hurried over to her child. Despite the excitement during the night, Gareth woke before the dawn. He was grateful that he had not overslept, for he had determined to remove Evrain from the house before the others were awake. That day they would have to talk, until they could find a way to save the drowning man. Evrain slept like the dead. He smelled awful, of sweat and stale wine and indescribable places he had been the day before. Gareth roused him by pouring a cup of water over his head. If he had been in any better condition, he would certainly have shouted and cursed, but all he could manage was a low moaning that the boy ignored. Under the threat of more violent treatment, Evrain was goaded from bed. He covered his eyes with a hand, but allowed Gareth to drag him to the washroom. Here there was no gentle soak in a heated tub, but a shivering cold bucket of water, the hard soap, and another bucket to rinse. Clean clothes were found for the grumbling man, now wide awake. He dressed himself with what Gareth suspected to be deliberate clumsiness, but he would not relent in the face of such small spite, and bundled his shuffling charge through the gate before he had even fastened the girdle round his waist. After a glance at the hovering eyes, Evrain realized how early it still was. His voice was a low mumble, for even his footsteps echoed in his head.
We are too early for the boat.
Gareth spoke forcefully.
We are not going to the boat.
What? Then where?
We are going to an inn where we can get some food into you. Then we are going to talk, because you are in no condition to go to the boat as yet.
Evrain looked at him askance, and opened his mouth to protest. The boy gave him no opportunity.
You can have it your way, but don't be too surprised if the crew won't sail with you today.
Some memory of the day before and all the follies he had committed had to have seeped into the man's memory, for he shut his mouth abruptly and once more fell in beside Gareth. The early morning smell of baking bread swirled all about them as they walked. The seedier taverns and drinking holes were dark and quiet at this hour, having only closed a little while before, and Gareth was relieved to shunt Evrain through the door of a cozy little place called the Keening Kestrel. The warm air inside was clear of dark and morbid thoughts. They were the first custom of the day, and sat down in a corner. Gareth broke the rules to order food aplenty, though Evrain seemed little capable of joining him in the repast. The man interrupted only once, to ask for a bottle of wine. Gareth did not object to this, for he was biding his time. If anything, the smell of frying made Evrain seem even more miserable than what he had at first, and when the food arrived, he pushed away his plate immediately, assuring the boy that he could not eat a single bite. Instead, he reached for the bottle and poured a shaky cup for himself. This even appeared too much for him, and he merely stared at it between his hands while the boy ate in silence. When Gareth had finished, he leaned back with a sigh of satisfaction.
Why don't you eat something? You'll feel better.
I don't think so.
Evrain looked at the happy face in front of him.
You enjoy another's misery.
The boy had the audacity to smile at him.
You brought it on yourself, and you seem to like it, for there you have another cup.
He motioned with his eyes to where the cloudy liquid lay still untasted. Evrain ignored the remark, though it clearly did not please him. He needed to straighten the muddle of his memories.
What did you say earlier about the crew?
Gareth lost his smile.
They will not sail with you much longer.
Is this about yesterday? They should not have taken the boat.
Not just yesterday. All the days you have hidden in the taverns and shut them out.
They disobeyed my instructions.
You insulted them, and you would not hear them out.
I was drunk.
You are pushing everyone away from you.
I don't mean to. I need time to work it out.
But you are not working it out.
Evrain banged his fist on the table. His eyes flared open.
What do you want from me?
For a moment they stared at each other. Gareth thought with all his might to find some way of expressing what he felt. His brow had furrowed with the effort, and his mouth was a tight line. The old despair rose up inside him.
I don't know who you were before. All I know is that you are not now the way you were when you helped me in the past. You were free there, and kind, and full of good humor, and you risked your life on my account.
He looked down at the table.
I liked you, The men liked you,
Evrain could not miss the meaning.
Liked.
and they still do. They would do anything to help you.
How can you help me?
I would do anything you want me to. So would Lur, and your family.
Tell me the truth.
The boy's voice rose in pitch.
I am. I'll tell you all of it.
He leaned forward.
You cannot continue like this.
Evrain looked at him with bleary eyes.
I know.
He pressed the forefinger and thumb to the bridge of his nose.
No, you don't. It is getting worse.
In desperation, he grabbed the man's free hand.
You are going to hurt her.
The tired eyes widened.
Last night?
Gareth nodded dumbly.
What happened?
As simply as he could, the boy told of the argument, the anger, the tears, and the threat of violence. Evrain averted his eyes.
I can't talk to her, Gareth. Not anymore. She blames me. I know this. For taking Zane out, for allowing him to drown, for running away to the north. I don't know what to say to her.
You must speak to her and tell her everything you feel. I know she wants to do the same.
The lie sounded as true as he wanted it to be. There was no reply, only a slow shaking of the head. Gareth continued.
You will have to apologize to Lur and the others after what you said yesterday.
Evrain sighed heavily.
Are you going to be my conscience?
Do you need me to be? I should think that you know already what is fair and right, but I will remind you if you like.
Gareth wore an expression of such sincere goodwill that Evrain could not help but smile, though it was the last thing he felt like doing. He was so tired, of pain and emptiness, of losing the simple joy of living, of the impossible weight of guilt, and now he only added to it daily, till it would become a mountain he could not hope to scale.
I have failed terribly, Gareth. I'm caught in a nightmare here. I have failed my wife, for even now that I have returned at last, I cannot face her. I have failed Ranald and you in not protecting you here in Kiel as I have promised. I am about to fail my crew in the race.
He sighed once more.
Maybe I am the one who should go stay with Lur.
Oh, stop being so silly. All these things you can change if you want.
Evrain made no reply, but merely raised skeptical eyebrows.
Yes.
Gareth took heart from the fact that he had not been contradicted outright.
First, no more of this,
He jabbed a finger in the direction of the bottle.
because it turns you into a beast. Second, we'll take the boat out today, even if you turn green and have to lean over the side.
You little whelp!
Evrain gasped in mock astonishment at such impertinence.
I will show you who will lean over the side.
And third, you will stay with Lur tonight to sober up,
Sober up! I am sober, you miserable...
while I go and talk to your wife to apologize for your bad behavior, your cowardice, your lack of consideration.
Evrain had fallen silent, and Gareth suddenly feared that he had gone too far. The man's face had clouded again with sadness, but when he spoke, his voice was firm and determined.
And you will tell her that I cannot see her suffer so, that I want to come home and help her.
And you will not have a drop too much?
Yes, and that.
He lowered his face into his hands.
My head hurts mightily.
I know just the medicine.
Gareth said as he rose to drag the man into the bright morning light outside. Men were waiting at the harbor after all. They wore identical expressions of concern and unhappiness as the two approached. Gareth exchanged a knowing glance with Evrain before they reached the silent men. The captain faced his crew with acute embarrassment. In halting speech, he stumbled through a string of confessions, and when he faltered, as he often did, the boy at his side would nudge him with an elbow. If the matter had not been quite so serious, Lur and the watermen would have been hard-pressed not to burst out laughing at such a scene. But the many days of worry and doubt left him with nothing but a grateful relief. Halfway through, they made an attempt to wave away the apology, but Evrain would not be deterred until he had spoken his fill. Each of the crew then had a turn to say something appropriate, till the whole group stood around in silent awkwardness, a little red in the face. Lur finally spurred them to action by asking whether they were going to spend the rest of the morning in speech-making, or whether they would rather get their idle hands on the fishing nets. The boat was readied with something close to exuberance, and each of the crew found a moment behind the captain's back to press Gareth's arm or pat him on the shoulder. They more than suspected his involvement in this sudden turnabout. For all, the sun seemed brighter, the wind fresher, and the company of greater cheer than it had in a long while. For Gareth, there waited another, even trickier battle in the evening. Once more he approached the gate alone and rang the bell with a leaden hand. Across the bay the last rays of golden light lingered on the ocean, while the soft breeze moved the grass in slow waves round his feet. So much depended on what would be said this night, and he was utterly unprepared for it. He could not speak to Mirail as he had to Evrain, for he was afraid of her silence, her obvious dislike of him, and above all, her tears. Lay opened the gate, looking at him with a little smile, though the dejection of the previous night still lingered in her manner. There was disappointment, too, he thought, because he was alone. Mirail placed the steaming dish of stew on the table as he entered. She looked apprehensive for a moment, till she understood that her husband had not accompanied him home. She directed her gaze back to the table as she nervously wiped her hands on her apron. Her voice came to him as if for the first time.
Please, eat with us.
He stared at her in surprise. Then he held out his hands.
I must wash.
He felt a complete fool. Her sudden awkwardness matched his.
Yes, we will wait for you.
Gareth disappeared to the washroom, wondering if she perhaps still believed him a simpleton. That might be why she spoke in that slow manner. He scrubbed his hands up to the elbows out of habit, though they had brought in no fish that day, and he hardly needed to clean them so thoroughly. Yet he delayed returning to the table in order to work up the courage he lacked. They were seated as he entered. Both pairs of eyes followed his every step. One of the chairs was missing from the table. As he sat down opposite them on one of the remaining 5, he saw it next to the hearth, tottering on 3 legs. The furniture, then, had not escaped without damage.
Shall we wait for Evrain?
Mirail's voice was at once hopeful and apprehensive.
No, he will not come home tonight. Why?
She looked at him anxiously, as any other wife concerned for her husband. Surely this was a good sign. Gareth delivered his one prepared answer.
He is overcome with remorse and shame.
He was not sure whether she believed him. The tension grew rather than abated. At first he thought that he would not be able to eat more than a few mouthfuls, but the stew was certainly the best he had eaten since arriving in Kiel. Mirail had gone to some trouble in preparing it, perhaps as a gesture of reconciliation and forgiveness. This, again, was a positive sign. The boy began to relax, enjoying the well-seasoned fish, the leeks and onions, the fresh corn cakes sweetened with honey, and he knew for whom all this had been prepared. His task would be much easier than he had anticipated. Mirail seemed caught in struggles of her own. She ate little, lost in thought. Towards the end of the meal she straightened up, as if she had come to a decision. Stretching out one hand on the table, she spoke the name of the strange guest from Nuria for the first time.
Forgive me, Gareth. I never knew how to treat you. I had the impression...
She hesitated. The boy swallowed hastily.
It matters not. But it does. And after last night, I know that I have misjudged you, and I should have realized sooner. Your eyes are bright and clever, the way you move. You could not keep up such a pretense.
Gareth felt a little pang of guilt.
You were misled. I misled myself. I have done it since my little boy.
She forced herself to speak the dreaded word.
Died.
For a moment their eyes met. Hers were cloudy with pain and sorrow, but there was also a pleading to be understood. She turned away abruptly.
Forgive me. I find it hard to look at you.
The eyes again, Gareth thought. Did he really seem such an abomination to them?
I can close my eyes, if that will help.
Miriel turned back, frowning in incomprehension. Then she smiled sadly.
It's not that. What you think. It is just... You are alive. You breathe, you laugh, you sleep in his room. I've seen him in every boy of this town, till I could not bear leaving the house anymore.
She looked at him in an odd way, biting her lip.
You have a difficult time here? No, it is much better than I expected. I love the sea and the boats.
He hastily dismissed the memory of a shadow outside his window at night.
If only you and Evrain would not be sad all the time. Why is it that you do not talk to him?
He regretted saying the words almost as soon as they had slipped from his mouth. Miriel covered her face with her hands. Her voice sounded hollow.
He does not come close to me. We were the best of friends. You wouldn't understand. Every night he told me of the day and the catch and the joy of seeing his son grow strong. We laughed so much. Now he will not say a word about the storm. He will not tell me about that day. He feels he is to blame.
Gareth's voice was soft, as if he was trying to soothe a young child.
Everyone blames him for what happened. Even you.
She drew in her breath sharply, but he continued hastily.
And though it is not the truth, and everyone wants to help him, he cannot see it.
He thought of the miserable face he had seen that morning across the table in the Keening Kestrel.
You must make him see it. How?
Miriel stared at him forlornly.
Tell him what you really feel, what you want. He asked me this morning what I wanted from him, and all I could think was for him to be how he was before, when he saved me in the past. He saved you? 3 times, or more. He is a brave and kind man. I know that well.
There were tears on her cheeks now, but her voice was steady.
I want him to take me out in his boat, to where it happened. I want to put my hands in the water that has taken my boy, and say farewell to him. We had no body to bury.
She wiped away the tears with an impatient hand.
May I tell him that?
Gareth knew the battle was won. He wondered how he would wait through the night with the news.
I should tell him that.
She rose to her feet, suddenly resolute. Gareth and Leigh rose with her.
Where is he? At Lurs. I will go and fetch him.
She drew her little girl to her.
Leigh and I will go and fetch him.
The water's round keel wore the same heady blue as the sky, and parted before the bow in eager haste. The wind, strong and steady, ever sweeping in from the southwest, drove the fleeing hull under bulging, bursting sails, till the sheer rush of it stole away one's breath and touched one's heart with exhilaration. The white of the sea leaped playfully over the sides to touch the bodies of the men struggling there with ropes and stays. And how they smiled, these men, how they laughed, to harness such power, such joy, till darkness fled from them and every thought was light. They were one with the elements, exploring one avenue of tight speed till another opened itself to them. The taste of the ocean was on their lips. The brightness of the sun covered each body like a coat. The flying wind lashed back their hair and filled their lungs till they shouted with delight and sensed the soaring freedom of the birds. For days they danced through the low swell of the open water, till the golden pathway of the westering sun would call them home. No one thought of fishing now. All aspirations and energies were bent towards the rock, and the exercising of such skills as would aid them in getting there before any other competitor. Evrain gradually allowed the exuberance that coursed through his crew to grow in him also. The tensions were forcibly forgotten, and every mind sought only to see the good qualities of the others. Even when a promising breeze had left them in becalmed state some miles from the port, though it was but the noontide of the day, there was no chafing or fretting. The watermen went over the side with their fishing spears. Evrain and Lur inspected the sails and deck, while Gareth slumped at the bulwark, glad to have nothing to do for a while. It was suddenly hot, with the wind no longer breathing over them. He had half a mind to pull on his discarded rein, but was suddenly too lazy to stir and look for it. The sea-water, curiously calm and bereft of the regular swell, held his gaze in its azure, inviting clarity. Pale, undulating lines of sunlight played along the surface, slowly drawing him into their embrace. He felt small in the half-dark of the courtyard, small and fearful, though the fear was for discovery rather than the result of a perceived threat. 7 columns of stone stood at regular intervals to his right, supporting a raised walk, itself shaped from heavy grey stone. A single lamp, its flame bright as the sun, was suspended from the middle column. There was no sound, and he could not fathom why he needed to linger here, till he remembered the calm, the slight pause between events of importance about to unfold. He would wait, and occupy his mind with what he saw. The craftsman had conjured the shapes of several creatures from the stone of the pillars, and he drew near the first to examine it. He moved slowly, and a little unsteadily, as if the ground beneath the flagstones of the yard was something less than solid. It was the figure of a swan embossed on the flat surface. He traced the outlines of its graceful neck, lifting from his memory the swans of the garden city in Nuria. Oh, the flowered parks and silent pools of store! The rich soil of the place where the rivers joined yielded fruit of a fragrance and sweet flavor unmatched in the north. How long he stared at the memory was impossible to tell. A damp mist had crept about his feet unawares, till it flowered into the night air and drew a bright ring about the lamp. Cloaked in darkness, a tall archway at the opposite end of the courtyard abruptly bulged with movement. Cool waves of expectation instantly washed over him, and he knew that this was the reason he had lingered here. He stood rooted and transfixed, one hand still on the stone of the swan. Caught in the welling of such fierce hope, he could do nothing but stare. The shape of a man stepped boldly across the yard. Power and purpose flowed about him in almost visible currents, parting the mist where he moved. On his left hip rode a Viran blade, itself a potent claim, bright in overuse. The face, lit up by the passing lamp, was achingly familiar to him, but set hard with sorrow and bitter pain. The moment came, a pause in the confident stride, a fragile second suspended against the brightness. A mere breath and whisper of fate. The man furrowed his brow ever so slightly in an unasked question. His expression softened into surprise, even shock, and then he was past, swept away in the flow of time and duty. But there he could still see the eyes, the touch of that stare, the shock of it. And oh, he felt now the anguish of wretched lies, twisting back and back to stark and evil origins. He wanted to weep and to laugh, for now he knew the impossible truth. This striding figure, whose gaze had fallen on him in violent recognition, this stranger, at once unknown and intimately familiar. The hand was rough upon his bare shoulder. It belonged to Yulan.
Whoa there, boy. You almost pitched into the water. Where's your mind gone?
I was just thinking.
He felt a fool, his thoughts still thick and slow with the potency of the dream. He was alarmed to feel wetness on his cheeks, and almost raised a hand to brush it away.
Well, think a little less, or I'll have to fish you out of the sea.
In a moment he was on his feet.
Oh, fish me out, will you?
He leaped over the side wildly, and was grateful when the water closed over him. The last thing he wanted was for the waterman to notice the traces of his tears. Almost instantly, he felt strong arms around him, dragging him up to the surface. They broke it sputtering and laughing, Gareth perhaps a little louder than the waterman, but then he had more need of it. Keel was bursting at the seams. All along the white strip of sand, boats had been beached in an endless line of colorful activity. 142 vessels had crowded into the bay, one by one spilling onto the sand for a final check by the anxious crews. Approximately half of them were smaller craft, carrying but 2 men, and with masts not quite as tall as the Sunsway. Sailors and fishermen from all the coastal towns of Arran, large and small, soon crowded together on the sand in groups of familiarity, those from the same town drifting together out of habit. The groups vied with each other in raucous conversation and displays of joviality. Tall men from Oncrest and Ambervent in the West March, in their particular rolling speech, the rowdy South Coast men from Kiel, Sunderland, and a half-dozen hamlets between, a strong contingent from the Rock itself, and the East Coast men from Wingmere to Lee. There were young men and old, greybeards and boys, everyone with an eager gleam in the eye and a secret hope in the heart that this cycle the winds would be favorable for them. Evrain and his crew slowly made their way through the forest of craft, casually inspecting the condition of larger boats, clasping a hand here and there as familiar faces loomed. Gareth had remained at the Sunsway to avoid too many curious glances, but Maelor and Yulan, unlike the majority of the Murden crew members, pointed and discussed with energy among the Arranites. They smiled and gloated secretly at the lack of understanding or pure laziness evident everywhere. The vast majority of vessels had never felt the touch of brigand leaves or some similar material, and their hulls, masts, and decks were rough and weather-worn. A good dozen of the more serious competitors had boats in better condition, but none wore as sleek and glossy a coat as the Sunsway. Even Ballred's Blue Reef looked as though she had not been touched since a cycle before. The ropes and rigging were in as bad a state as the hulls, though each no doubt carried several yards of new rope. In case an older section might snap under the strain, it would cost that crew valuable time to replace worn rigging under racing conditions. It was clear that most sailors were content with running to the Rock, while knowing that they would win no first place. It was a matter of pride simply to compete, and the ones who completed the race had the right to tack a button of brass onto the mast of their vessel in commemoration. The Sunsway carried 14 such buttons, in addition to 2 silver plaques, for the winning runs of 584 and 586. A gold plaque could be earned only for a record time, and since the stormy one-day run of a certain Pentrith in 237, few hopes of such an honor were still entertained. Gareth chafed at being left alone, while he had 1,000 questions to ask. It was an awakening of sorts to see the vast array of craft and crew in the Bay of Kiel. For the first time, he realized the truth of his tutor's inflated warnings against the numbers of the western land compared to the smaller towns and cities of Nuria. This realm was rich in people and could field armies many times the size of the Nurian force. He could never have dreamed that this would become to him a source of comfort and security. A light westerly breeze stirred over the bay, swirling around him as he sat staring out from the bow. The air was dry, with the salty flavor of the sun-tide ocean. An evening cool settled with the deepening light, but the crowds did not disperse to taverns as he had expected. Here and there cooking fires had sprung up, and soon the enticing odor of frying fish floated on the breeze. Vendors from the town moved about selling bread, wine, and ale, or even cooked vegetables. It was evident that some tradition kept the men close to their boats on this night before the race. Indeed, Evrain and the others made no effort to return to the Sunsway and head for home. He could still make out their shapes as they stood talking and laughing with a clump of men at the water's edge. A slight apprehension tensed his shoulders at the sight of so many strangers, and the knowledge that an assailant would find it much easier to draw close under such conditions. Yet he was still aware of the silent guardians, hidden but ever vigilant. He was safe enough, even if he spent the night here by himself. The descending dark brought men closer around their fires. There they would sit in little groups, eating and gossiping, regaling one another with yarns of their greatest feats, most miraculous escapes, and encounters on the deep. There would be many silent answers and sympathies in the eyes of the hearers, for they shared in this fierce love and fear of the sea. The words, however exaggerated, brought to their minds the many adventures that had left them trembling and grateful to be alive, or awed into silence by such display of beauty and the sheer power they had witnessed. There was Fied, a veteran from Ambervent in the West March, his eyes sparkling with the telling of his close defeat the previous cycle, his blonde beard a mane of gold around the dark sun-bronzed face. Across from him sat the boy captain from Aaron Rock, Davin, with his crew in their pale blue reins. None of them had more than 15 cycles, but for him, who barely had 19. Still, their youth had not prevented them from almost stealing the third place from the Sunsway. Davin was older and wiser now, and more determined. These lads would soon make sailors beyond compare. All the men rose to their feet as Evrain joined them. Fied clapped him on the back and clasped his hand a moment longer than the others. A wordless compassion passed between them. The Ambervent man had tasted too of loss on the deep of the endless ocean. There was a brief nod before Evrain passed on to a smiling Davin, who had once assured him that he would not be trailing the Sunsway this cycle. Lur smiled in response that the boy would not come close enough to trail them, at which indignant voices from Davin's crew rose in protest and reduced Lur to a trembling grandfather in need of speedy retirement. There were more smiles and laughter as he ruffled the hair of the smallest boy and told him to go ask his mother for a bob on the knee. The boy colored in embarrassment, but Davin came to his rescue by stating that he had 13 cycles and 3 younger brothers who had already outgrown that custom. Lur relented.
It is but a jest, lad. Most crews have younger boys still on board. I admire one who prefers the smell of salt water to the taste of milk.
There was more laughter. Fiad interrupted the pleasantries with his booming voice.
You're sailing with only 3 men, Ivry. Where's the other member of your crew?
No, I have another. A boy of this one's size.
He pointed to the one whose hair Lur had ruffled.
On board the boat. Scared someone will steal it.
This came from one of Fiat's men.
Why don't you tell them the truth?
Next craned to see the newcomer, who had spoken these words in challenge. Bolred stepped into the circle of light, his shoulders set in arrogance. Fiat's voice was stark and hostile.
Ah, our noble champion. You still associate with lesser men, Bolred.
You know, Fiat, men from Ambervent should really learn not to be so small in defeat.
Fiat opened his mouth to say that he would show the rotten son of Kiel slums who the small man was, but thought the better of it. He glanced at Evrain, who stood glaring at Bolred as if at an intruder. His curiosity was roused.
What truth would you be referring to?
Bolred paused long enough to turn all eyes on him.
Oh, you must have heard the rumors already. I can tell you they are true.
He jerked his head in Evrain's direction.
He has a Nurian on his crew this cycle.
What? All the heads swung towards Evrain, then back to the little man.
Yes, a half-foot boy at that. That's why he hides him on the boat. He picked him up in the pass, I hear. His own people obviously wanted to be rid of him.
Evrain had had enough.
You needn't speak, Bolred, as if I'm not here present with you. We are none of us children anymore. Besides, what is it you have against this boy? that you have to rile against him at every opportunity.
Ballred raised his voice.
His race, for one.
His race. How is it that you can blame a man for what he was born with? Whether he has talent or not, whether he looks fair or not, whether his sight is strong or weak, these things are beyond his control. But what you can blame him for is whether he is cruel and mean, or kind and generous, whether he is a good honest neighbor or a sly rat who considers only himself. It is the evil that he does you can blame him for.
There were shouts of agreement all around. Ballred noticed the shift in feeling and tried another tack.
Should we wait then, till he has murdered one of us in our sleep? He's Viron, and such things are in their nature.
And what is it that you know about Nurians and their nature? I do not recall seeing you in the past too often.
Laughter flowed around them. Ballred sensed an opportunity.
We are at war with Nuria. They raid and kill on our soil. You find an excuse for this?
There is no excuse for such. Though we do the same on their soil, I do not forget that the men across the pass are my neighbors too, and the distant kin of my people.
You speak like a traitor.
Evrain froze. A tense silence fell on the bystanders.
Take that back.
The small man stood rigid, unmoving. His face was flushed and anxious, but he was not willing to bow to Evrain's implied threat in front of all these people. Lur put a restraining hand on Evrain's arm.
Don't listen to the ramblings of this fool.
He stepped forward till he stood between the men.
Ye ever seen a battle, Ballred? I think not. The closest ye've seen to it is when ye sneak back home of a night from the brothel. This man has taken many a one for your sorry backside's sake,
He pointed to Evrain.
and killed men while ye lay besotted in the reaping sun, and ye will talk of treason. If I were ye, I would not draw too much attention to my cowardly self.
There were smiles again and the shaking of heads. Ballred tried once more.
That is all fine talk. But this man,
Again Evrain had a finger pointed at him.
he's taken much with Nurians.
Evrain took a step to stand next to Lur. He looked down at his adversary.
Why do you persist with this folly? You want to see the Nurians all of a kind, when a child could tell you it is not so. Some Nurians are bad men, no doubt. Some may murder you in your sleep. But this is not because they are Nurians, it is because they are bad. And bad men are found on every coast of Myrol, even ours. The kinship of race does not make men all alike. You and I are of the same people after all.
Again there was a wave of nods and some laughter. Ballred knew he had lost the round, and he turned to go. Yet an arrow remained of which he would now make use in defeat. Self-assured captain in front of him was going against the wisdom and beliefs of his race. This could only end in disaster.
You can raise an eagle in the nest of a hawk, Evrain, but you'll come to grief over it in the end. That Viron child does not belong here in Kiel, nor does he belong on your crew.
There was jeering now, as the men had sided against him. A Murden man rudely asked whether that was the reason Ballred had no watermen on his crew, and others immediately answered in the affirmative. Of all the men, only Evrain remained silent. The last of what the braggart had said had struck him as uncomfortably close to the truth. It was enough to set him to wonder whether he really believed what he had spoken so bravely, and whether the men, now so quick to agree with him, would still do so on the morrow. The night dragged past in discomfort. As was customary, all the seamen slept in or around their boats, while several watchmen from Kiel patrolled the beach. The wind had died away completely. The sea lapped at the shore in small, lazy wavelets, while Lauren's eyes pulled its low light across the dark canopy inch by slow inch. It seemed to Gareth that he had spent much more time awake than sleeping when the eastern sky paled at last. The watermen were up already, frying 4-inch-long liners in a skillet over the fire. They seemed relaxed and unperturbed by the lack of sleep, and winked at him as he approached. Halor offered him the first of the fried fish.
Going to have some trouble today with the start. Seems to be little chance of wind.
How do you know?
Gareth took the fish and helped himself to an apple from their store.
Sea's too flat, and the air's clear and hard.
The waterman leaned over his skillet, turning the liners with a long needle used for mending sails. The first rays of the sun whitened the rising steam, and framed his bending figure in light almost too bright for the eye. Gareth knew better than to ask what hard air might be. Such questions had been ignored before, and he had had to satisfy himself with an odd look and his own imagination. He busied himself with his food, and stared at the horizon, trying to decide what quality of the daylight could be regarded as hard. Evrain and Lur added their opinions as soon as they had joined the others at the cooking fire. Both frowned at the sea and the air before complaining that the race would be a slow one that cycle. The sun-gilded beach now teemed with movement and color. A stirring excitement gripped each heart. The men of the Sunsway lingered over their meal.
What are they hurrying for? It's still a good while before the second watch.
Lur removed the head, fins, and tail of a liner with a practiced cut before stuffing it into his mouth. Ephraim laughed.
They will learn patience today.
By noon, the flotilla of racing boats was spread out in a long, lazy line just outside the Bay of Kiel. All had crammed on every inch of canvas they had on board, yet the pace was frustratingly slow. Colorful mainsails hung slack, rippling only occasionally in a lost breath of wind. The leading boats were making use of their 2 sets of long oars, with more energy than the bulk of the crews, gaining what advantage they could. Evrain had stationed Gareth at the tiller at first, while the men rowed under the heat of the sun. Soon, however, as the other crews slowed, he moved Lur to steering and put the boy in front of him on the starboard oar. It was hot work and hard, for the day seemed like a furnace, and the close air hung about them in a heavy, humid curtain. The last day of suntide lay like a shimmering cloak over the sea. Maelor glanced at the sweating Gareth next to him.
You row well, boy, but you'll wear yourself out too soon.
Gareth looked at him while they leaned forward together, almost losing the rhythm of the stroke.
What do you mean?
You are fighting the oar. What should I do?
The waterman's stroke was far smoother and more flowing than his.
Do not dip the blade too deep into the water. It causes you to pull too hard. Don't try to make it go faster, just keep it moving.
Gareth tried to keep the grip of his oar on a level with Maelor's, and immediately felt the lessening of strain on his shoulders and back. Lur smiled at him from the tiller.
I'll give you a rest.
The boy shipped his oar and moved quickly to take up his position in the stern. The planking of the seat was almost too hot to sit on, and he folded his rein in half to place underneath him. Before taking the oar again, Lur looked at the other men in disgust.
This is no run. It's a crawl.
Yulan glanced out to where the 24 boats of the leading pack struggled around them.
As long as the others crawl also. We lose now.
Aye, but this boy will get the wrong impression of a race to the rock. And this is Buddy's first time out.
He grabbed the oar and fell in with energy.
Remember the run of 94? We reached the rock before the noon watch of the second day. That was flying. Our fastest one yet.
He shook his head slowly.
How that Pentrith ever made it in a day is past understanding. The quickest run ever.
Gareth leaned lazy over the tiller.
And the slowest race?
That would be the one 588. And we were in it, what's more. 2 days of complete calm we had. It was so bad that old man Jetting of Oncrest had his men rowed to shore at night, where he hired 2 ox carts to drag his boat overland to the rock. This was against the rules, of course, and it served him right when the wind rose the next day and he was left behind.
Evrain and Lur chuckled at the memory. Towards the end of the day watch, a dark bank of clouds massed towards the east. The men frowned at the sight of it. Even the gentle breeze, at last stirring from the same direction, brought no rejoicing other than the relief at being free from further rowing. As darkness fell, the breeze freshened, till it became an unpleasant gusting wind. Ere long the clouds had scudded in to obscure the stars and rob them of what little light they would have had. Evrain no longer had any means of navigating, and lashed the tiller while beating in a northeasterly direction. He had no intention of closing with the coastline and a potential undetected reef or sandbank. The men had not trimmed the sails as yet, and they were making good speed. They sat around the mast, eating their dried fish and resting their weary muscles, while Gareth called out to them the number and position of the other boats he could spot in the blackness. 4 others had opted for the same course as the Sunsway, but the majority had turned for the coast, unnerved by the stormy outlook. Evrain shook his head at this, for though they would enjoy a downwind reach to the coast, they would have to turn back ere long and fight their way northeastward into what could by then be a gale. The men took turns to sleep, but had little opportunity for it. Gareth felt Maelor's hand roughly shaking him awake before the 3rd watch had commenced. The first drops of what would become a heavy downpour set them scrambling for bowls and buckets. The wet sails flapped above them as they toiled to keep the rainwater out of their boat. They laughed and joked while moving fore and aft, but for Evrain it was a serious matter. Every bucketful of water weighed down his boat and made her slower than the competition. He was grateful for the Nurian eyes on board, for the other men had to work mostly by feeling their way around. Knowing where the water collected increased their efficiency considerably and allowed them brief intervals of rest. The day dawned gray and miserable. It had rained on and off throughout the night, and the men were tired. Behind the Sunsway, 4 boats doggedly beat their way through the heavy swell. Among them fluttered the colors of Polred and Davin, who led the others in his boat, the Daystar. Lur smilingly remarked that the young man was trailing them again after all. Evrain retorted that he obviously knew what was good for him, as long as he kept his distance. The critical moment now approached, for the decision had to be made when to tack and set a winning course for the rock. They were out of sight of land and had to estimate their relative position. The strong wind showed no sign of abating or changing direction, and would allow for a speedy passage once they had it at their backs. The timing had to be near perfect, else the eager crew might overshoot the port at Aaron Rock, or meet the shoreline too far to the south, and would be forced to turn back or crawl in against the wind. Either way, another would have the opportunity of stealing victory from them. All his instincts told Evrain that the moment had come. The mainsail was trimmed before exposing it to the full force of the wind. The boat slowed considerably.
Ready about?
The men quietly moved to their stations. Lur manned the weather sheet, since its trimming demanded the most skillful handling. Keeping their heads low in the strong wind, each one turned to look back at Evrain.
Hard alee!
The Sunsway tacked in a slow, smooth maneuver, preserving her momentum. Once the driving wind filled her sails on the crew tack, the boat heeled alarmingly. Evrain brought her a little closer to the wind, while ordering everyone aft. Lur slackened the mainsail, securing it with a few turns on the cleat and a slipping hitch. A strong gust could well cause them to capsize if the main was not free to run. Despite the rough water and a heavy weather helm, the boat was running free now on a broad reach. Gareth had never felt her fly so swiftly. An old exhilaration took hold of him, till the fatigue dropped away and laughter filled his chest. The angry green sea parted for them as they raced the swell and whipped an occasional foamy lash over the side. The air rushed upon him in gusts, stealing away his breath when he faced aft. Evrain touched him on the shoulder and motioned him forward.
Get a hand on the jib. Keep your eyes to windward. And if you spot a puff, give me a sign.
Maelor was set to bailing again, for the seawater accumulating in the leeward part of the boat made it more difficult to keep her on her toes. Gareth lay flat in the bow, but the waterman motioned to him to sit up.
You need not keep low when we are reaching. We need the lightest man in the bow, that's all. She tends to heel too much as it is.
Able to look around at last, The boy spotted the other boats far behind. The pale blue Daystar had completed its tack as well, though some distance to the south of them, while the others were still beating into the wind. One by one they came about, following the line of the sun sway, each heeling over sharply as they caught the wind. Soon they were strung out behind the blue reef, several hundred yards to the east. By noon of the second day, the trailing boats were mere specks against the gray sky. Evrain knew the dipping and gliding of heavy swell riding better than most, and the slight tacks and jibes kept his boat reaching faster than the others. Only the young Davin kept up a gallant fight to the south, for he had lost less than half the distance the others had. At times the wind gusted to gale force, and Lur had his hands full with slackening and trimming the mainsail. One particularly nasty puff brought them to the brink of disaster. A loud snap and tearing sound followed the initial onslaught. Every eye fastened on the mast. For a moment cold dread settled over them. Losing a mast in this wind would not only cost them the race, but could endanger their lives. Lur had the sail trimmed before he noticed the tear. He pointed at it, shouting above the wind to his captain. Evrain was at once relieved and surprised when he saw what had caused the ominous noise.
This is a new sail. Shouldn't tear so easily.
He motioned to Gareth.
Slacken the jib.
The sail would have to come down to prevent further damage, and for Lur to effect repairs.
There, bring it down.
The older man was nonplussed.
Replace it?
No time for that. Repair it.
Lur wanted to argue, but the watermen were beside him in an instant, each with a mending needle at the ready. As soon as the sail came down, they were at it, closing the tear from opposite sides. It was not too large, and would lose them little time, yet the sudden reduction in speed perturbed them all. The boat heeled excessively as the wind drove against the jib only, and they could make little headway. To Evrain's immense frustration, he had to watch his lead slip away. First to close was the Daystar. Reaching closer to the wind, it had come more in line with the other boats. Following closely was Bolred and the rest. The champion had pulled away from the others by a good 50 yards. Trusting in the skill of his men, Bolred had let out his sails and gained a significant advantage of speed. Evrain was about to comment on the folly of such a risky course of action when he spotted the telltale signs of an exceptionally strong gust approaching. The Daystar had drawn abreast of them, and he pointed directly east while shouting a warning. There was no chance for his voice to carry to the others' ears, but his frantic motioning had attracted Davin's attention. His own crew had paused in their work to stare away to windward. The squall came rushing in from just north of east, turning the water in its path into a boiling field of white. The trailing boats, one after the other, buried their bows in the sea and lingered dangerously long in that position before slowly righting themselves.
Loose the jib.
Evrain shouted his instruction while changing course to turn his stern to the wind. Behind him the angry gust had overtaken Bolred and his men.
Oh, Imran's breath!
The blue reef had heeled over so sharply that all watching her was convinced she would capsize. They marveled that her mast had not snapped with the strain. Men scrambled frantically to bring her closer to the wind, while others jumped to trim the sails.
He has Lauren's own luck.
Lur shook his head.
The mast should have gone.
There was no time for a reply, for the wind squall was upon them now, and moments later struck the Daystar. Both boats leaned over under reduced canvas, the angry wind-crested waves leaping at the crew over raised sterns. For a few moments they were lashed mercilessly by the stinging spray, and then the gust had passed them by, leaving grim expressions in its wake. The wind, as if inspired by the passing violence, now shifted to the northeast. At least some of its fury had been spent in this last show, and it dropped somewhat in intensity. All the boats, with the sun sway now bringing up the rear, had to adjust their courses till they were on close reaches, heading more directly for the shore. Gaps now appeared in the gray, and shafts of sunlight fell through in sheer cascades to touch the sea below. The invisible sun would soon be setting on the second day of the race. During the night, they passed the two rearmost boats. Yet, When Lauren's eyes at last peeped at them from among a nest of stars, there was no sight of Ballred or Davin. Evrain checked his course, and hoped fervently that the others had altered theirs earlier, and not outdistanced him altogether. He glanced up at the mended mainsail, and cursed the merchants of Greenmere for selling him inferior goods. The wind slackened to a moderate breeze in the golden light of morning, and Evrain kept tacking from one reach to another to make the most of it. They could not be too far from the shore, and with the wind still northeasterly, Fied and the coast huggers would have to beat against it to reach the rock. The race had narrowed down to the three of them. They spotted Davin and the coast at the same time. Once they had made out the blue of his sail and recognized him beyond doubt, the features of the shore had become clear enough for them to realize their position. Davin had already altered his course, and thus confirmed their suspicions. Arran Rock lay further to the north of them. The Daystar, having turned for the shore somewhat earlier than the Sunsway, had lost its advantage and lead, for it would have to beat into the wind to make for port. If only Ballred had not turned further north than Davin, he would be in the same position, and Evrain would hold the race in his hands. At once they altered course due north, keeping pace with the Daystar several hundred yards to the south and west. Though closer to the shore, she would crawl the rest of the way without the advantage of a following wind, while they would speed into port from the east. Every man on board could taste the excitement. In front of them stretched the clear blue ocean with no sail in sight. The coastline gradually changed its face from sandy dunes to the towers and bastions of dark stone surrounding their destination. Fatigue dropped away from them, their eyes brightened, and volatile laughter lay shallow in each throat. There was the spire of the rock, rising free and solitary from the foundation of Arran. A last tack to catch the fading wind, and away they raced under bulging sails. A quick, worried glance at the patchwork on his mainsail satisfied Evrain that there would be no nasty surprises so close to the end. And then he saw the impossible. A dark shape scuttled into the port. Its sails angled in such a way that he could not recognize the boat, but then it could only be Ballred. The sickening disappointment swirled through him, and he dropped his head. None of the crew noticed his sudden despondency, and he had not the heart to destroy their moments of exhilaration. Yet he sighed at the wantonness of the fates that had him sailing for 2 days and nights through rough and contrary weather, only to let him fail with his goal in sight. The quaysides and walls of Arran Town were strangely empty as the Sunsway approached. Even on the rock and causeway there was no teeming crowd of cheering people. The everyday traffic made its lumbering way to and fro, almost as if the race had never been. Had Ballred won the hard-fought race to be welcomed by silence? Evrain took some guilty comfort from this possibility. As they rounded the weather wall of the harbor, a shout went up from several people there. Evrain noticed the workers and tavern patrons at last pouring out into the streets. And from across the way a trumpet call sounded from the rock fortress, announcing the arrival of the winner. All at once the streets and walls teemed with shouting, waving hordes. Evrain smiled and waved in return, though half-heartedly, all the while looking around him for the blue wreath. How amusing it was to receive the adoration meant for Ballred. His men were prancing about, hands raised high in triumph, among them the Nurian boy, as exultant as the rest, till he looked back at his captain's strange silence. He grabbed Lur by the arm and turned him in the direction of the stern. Lur's expression was a knot of puzzlement.
What's the matter? Winning not to your taste anymore?
Evrain smiled wryly.
We are not the winners. A boat came in before us. I think it was the Blue Reef.
The crew looked at him as if he had uttered an obscenity. Then they turned in all directions, their anxious eyes searching to verify this crazy claim. Several boats moved among the anchored warships in the harbor, but none bore the colors of their rival. A fishing boat of their size hurried past to starboard, the men cheering and waving as the rest. Lur understood at once.
There's your blue reef.
He turned to Evrain.
We're the first in. That was the spotting boat you saw.
Evrain stared from him to the boat and back. Certainly it had been the one dashing into port at the sight of the first boat from Kiel. His hopes caught alight once more. He threw his arms in the air with the rest, laughing wildly. All was light now, light and joy, and the satisfying of a long thirst. The journey home was pleasant compared to the race. A light following breeze from the northwest sped them towards Kiel in perfect conditions. The men smiled almost all the way, and paused often in their work to admire the new silver clock Evrain had tacked to the mast above the other two. They stood out as shining sentinels among the 14 brass buttons of unsuccessful attempts. 3 times the Sunsway had conquered in the race, but this last victory was the sweetest by far. Davin had sailed into the harbor shortly after to as enthusiastic a welcome as the Sunsway. He was Arantown's favorite, and their best hope for a victory. It had turned out to Evrain's delight that Balred had seriously misjudged his turning for the coast, overshooting the mark by almost an entire watch. He had had to be satisfied with the 5th place, when he had eventually come rushing in from the north. One shadow had darkened their bright exultation. Fied had brought with him report of an encounter with 3 slaver galleys during the 2nd day. The pirates had behaved oddly indeed, for they had not closed with a fleet of fishing vessels. Rather than showing hostility, they had kept their distance, till all the boats had passed their ships. Even then they had not turned for home, but rowed up the length of the flotilla as if in search of a particular boat. Eventually, having thoroughly frightened the participants, they had disappeared in a southerly direction. King Ranald had been outraged at this, and promised to provide an escort for future races. Yet Evrain and Gareth had realized soon enough that they had been extremely fortunate to escape what could only have been an attempt to finish what the assassins had failed to accomplish in Belruth. And this time there would have been no agents from the king or any other mysterious ally to protect them. Kiel itself seemed different as they rounded Limoen and headed into the bay for the familiar strip of sand. The sunlight, slanting in from the west, was more mellow and kind than before. The town sprawled in a warm and friendly half-circle round the blue water's edge, all carefree and sheltered. The lazy puffs of wistful cloud hung motionless and soft above it all. How easy it was to see beauty when the heart was filled with joy. Yet it was little wonder that they perceived the place as changed, for the last days of Suntide had departed. Soon, in the higher reaches of the land, leaves of oak and air would turn to brittle yellow and brown. The last of the harvests would be gathered and stored before the settling of the cold. Those were tranquil days, the first of leaf fall, when the dire winds of rhyme song were memories of a former cycle, rather than the heralds of new, darker days. The sun lost its stinging heat, the breeze its parching warmth, while the flowers and shrubs set free the last of their fragrance in a final ebullient display. Cool would creep into the morning watch and early eventide, till men would linger over morning meals and tell their tales round the hearth rather than the nets. For Gareth, the days after their return brought a new frustration. Evrain would not allow him to go out with the Sunsway. The slavers had clearly demonstrated their vulnerability at sea, and he could not risk a confrontation in which there would be no chance of victory. Though the boy understood this, he felt cheated out of his chief enjoyment. Suddenly he had time on his hands, and with little to do to occupy his mind, a strange mood dominated his days. He thought much on the horrific happenings in Belruth, the adventure and odd encounters of the journey, and the relentless pursuit to which he was still subjected. He thought of Kenneth of the towers, and the strange things he had said. Once more he saw the wall of glass, through which one might explore the world. Yet mostly he was waiting, for the sun to rise and set, for the sun's way to return, for the stars to flower overhead. It was not the kind of waiting that taxed the patience, nor even overpowered the mind with boredom. It seemed more to be a time of respite, a lull before the coming storm, as if the end of it would strain one's fortitude and resolve to the utmost. The townsfolk of Kiel no longer regarded him with suspicion or disdain. Mostly there was a friendly nod or wink when he passed by, and he was quick to smile in return. He almost laughed to think how different it had been in Belruth, where he had been the son of a king. There was laughter in Evrain's home also. Mirael and Lay made him uncomfortable with their open gratitude, but he enjoyed the light atmosphere and easy conversation the place had lacked before. Lur seemed to take his welfare to heart, as no one else, and even prevailed on Evrain on his behalf regarding the fishing trips. Whenever the wind was favorable for a quick dash to port, Gareth would be allowed to accompany them. On such days the Sunsway stuck with the other fishing boats for added security, and the crew kept one eye on the horizon. Gareth still enjoyed his swimming in the morning and afternoon, even when a cold easterner would comb back the breakers and drive the sand waist-high along the beach. In the silence and dark of an early morning, one could almost hear the music of the stars for a sacred moment before plunging into the inky sea. And when the body was pleasantly tired, and every limb still tingled with the rush of blood, the dull glow of daylight stood warm and marvelous against the rim of Myril. More enticing yet was the slow settling dream on the harbor wall till after sunset. He had grown fond of watching the far horizon over the endless rolling waves, for thoughts came clear and certain when the vision was unobstructed. For brief moments he could touch the glassy pane in the towers and almost bend time and distance to his will. Lur found him on the wall on the eve of the first 10th day of reapage. The boy sat motionless, etched against the vermilion sky, his arms stretched behind, supporting his frame, his palms flat on the wet stone. In the dim light he seemed quite ordinary, yet Lur had seen too much of him to fall for such trickery. There was nothing ordinary about this Nurian child. Several days before, Lur had confessed to him that he would have slit his throat that first evening in the northern woods if it had not been for Evrain. Gareth had stared at him in horror and lifted his hands to his throat. The man had almost regretted telling him when he had noticed the slight smile. They had joined in laughing lightly about what had weighed so heavily on his conscience. No, this was no ordinary child. In silence he walked over to the seated figure. He went to stand next to him, pretending a similar fascination with the view. The boy glanced up at him quickly before resuming his reverie. Lur dropped a few words into the pool of silence.
It is true, then.
He frowned down at the boy.
What is true?
Gareth kept staring at the lapping waves. The evening breeze stirred coolly with the fading of suntide, brushing cold fingers over the nape of his neck, and making the fine silvery hairs on his forearms stand on end. He thought of putting on his rein, though the wind was still soaked with seawater. He drew his knees up instead, putting his arms around them.
That ye are a sorcerer.
Though Lur's mock-serious tone proved his playful intentions, Gareth looked up sharply.
What do you mean?
The man leaned back and folded his arms.
I've seen it for myself. What you did with Evrain and Mirael. He's a different man this side of hunting than when he arrived here. This very morning he told me that he is not too old to father another son or two. That is nothing short of sorcery.
He pointed a finger.
And I know who is to blame.
Gareth smiled in relief and part embarrassment.
No. There was nothing I did.
He may try to deny it.
Lur was smiling too.
I've known both of them all their lives. One's as stubborn as the other. It was a close thing, or we had a great misfortune here in Kiel.
He was serious again.
I cared deeply for those two, and little Lay, and I want to thank ye that they are fine again.
Gareth looked away in awkwardness, not knowing what to say. He merely shrugged his shoulders and sat staring at his toes till the man had departed. The darkness had settled round him. Somehow he had lost track of the time, and Evrain would no doubt be concerned. He was not usually so late for the evening meal. A bright fire played among the early stars, as if the sun could touch them still from beyond the horizon. He shivered, though the breeze had disappeared completely. The broad breathing of the sea, and the closer, louder wavelets churning among the rocks, intoned their familiar harmonies. Yet he strained his ears for another, higher voice, as though the night itself could whisper, and be heard above the rushing water.
Gareth,
He could not move.
see for yourself.
Fingers, light and insubstantial as the dark, brushed against his neck, tilting his face towards the sky, and then the stars leaned down in dazzling white. It was no dream, or even a portent, as he had experienced them before. There was no pain, no overpowering sickness, no fainting fit. Instead, he felt a cool refreshing, as of the dew in a fragrant garden of flowers. This was true knowledge and enlightenment. Close beside him was the seer, drawing back the veils one by one, wherever his thought would turn. At once he could escape the hold of Myro and the perspective of crawling things. Days rolled past, days and nights without number, in a crazy rush till the beginning of time. A fresh sun had burst into fire from the void. It lingered for a moment, brilliant and beautiful. The voice was thought and understanding.
Why do you strive and struggle in this world? What is your purpose here?
The gold ore proceeded to a single jewel, the twin moons turning cartwheels after it. In another time, the All-Mother was trustful and alone, her eyes young and eager for love. Among the tall trees of her place she wandered, ever yearning for a glimpse of her beloved. The breezes of the eventide whispered to her of his virtues, of his many deeds of bravery, the greatness of his name. But her heart grew empty and cold with unfulfilled longings. Then there slipped in a shadow among the trees, another form, who moved in silent sympathy to listen to her lament, and in so doing bring her a small measure of comfort. So soon her eager glance was for this shape that strayed on the edge of vision, present at first only in the subtle moving of ferns and the deepened shade of the brush. Her words, composed in morning meditation, were meant for him to hear. Her secret longings found an echo in his lingering presence. Closer he drew to her, and she would lure him, draw him out from where he was hiding. She played her emptiness away, and was distracted from her grief, till soon enough she looked only for the form of her friend among the sweet flowers and the silent lanes. At last, when he touched her, she did not shy away, and her love fell from its lofty perch of virtue, twisting her dreams of old into a stark regret and present guilt. When finally the radiance of her husband strode into the garden, her smile was false as the open arms and perfumed bower fabricated to hide her shame. But the two boys mirrored each the nature of his father, and as they grew, so did the difference in appearance. The proud heart was broken, and the shadows rejoiced in such a confrontation. Anger, fierce and unforgiving, cast aside the foundering love. Too quickly it ripened into vengeful war. And what of her, the object of such disdain? Would she stand with one who cast her off? Would she defect to the side of the deceiver? Was she but a fertile field, fought over and claimed by the strong? No, she would fortify herself with spite, beguile the pretender, and scorn the proud. She would not touch the child of her erstwhile husband, Instead, she embraced the son of her shame and shaped him for a terrible purpose. And all became prisoners of Myril and themselves. The All-Mother was held by spite and bitterness, her husband consumed by affront and vengeance. Chains of jealousy, hatred, and fear enslaved the deceiver, while his progeny fell to the sharp needs of the parent's guilt. Alone the other son was free, not wanted or needed by either side. While the anger ebbed and flowed, in subtle skirmish and open battle, he walked the land for his own purpose. The hand was still upon the back of his head, the seer's hand, the guardian of the course. And there he saw again the room of glass in the towers, and the fiery gold and amber of the eyes. Kenneth was no keeper, he was the seer himself.
Understand, Kareth, and take your light into the Dark Isle. Remind him of purpose and restitution.
The words, like the words at the stone, flowered into images of an island, its beaches and rocky promontories awash with the waves of the inland sea. Perched on the highest hills sat an old fortress of stone, while its master, older still, huddled in front of a blazing hearth. It was impossible to speak, impossible to move. Even the urgency of breathing was a faded memory. He sat motionless, trying to fit what he had seen into the confines of his mind and understanding. Gradually he became aware again of his arms and legs, the prickling in his fingers. He opened not his eyes till he could feel the muffled beating of his heart. Only then was he sure to find familiar sights around him.